Claire, thank you so much for joining us. You have written about many courageous women. Why? What's your calling?
Well, there is a rich seam of untold women's history. And even when these stories are now coming to light, they still tend to be told in very romantic terms. I think when we think about women in the resistance or female special agents or spies, we tend to think about their courage, their sacrifice. And of course, we do have to honour that. But also we focus on their beauty. What we're much less good at remembering is how effective these women were. So I want to write about this history and talk about the achievements of the women as well.
What's her background that she was able to work her way into being a trusted contact of someone in Poland's military and parachuting into Poland?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating where she came from. I think to understand her, you have to remember that Poland has centuries of history of being invaded, annexed and occupied by its aggressive neighbour countries, but also centuries of defiance and resistance. And women often took part in that. And so Zoe was really brought up knowing she had to defend her country, she said that she sucked in patriotism with her first breath, with her mother's milk. It was really part of her DNA. And actually, when she was born in 1909 in northwestern Poland, very historic, beautiful Polish town called Torun. But when she was born, that had been annexed into an earlier German empire, the Prussian Empire. And so when she was brought up, she wasn't allowed to speak Polish. Even her name, Elżbieta, is the Polish version of Elizabeth, but she had to be called Lisa or Liesel, the German version of Elizabeth. And in fact, legally, she was German, but she knew inside that she had to fight for her country's freedom. And of course, what the Germans didn't realise at that time was what they were doing was creating a perfect spy from knee high. She spoke fluent German and Polish. And she was learning to live with a double life, a secret identity, even when she was a child.
You write about how she created an all-female intelligence network.
That's right.
How did she do that? How many people were in it? What did they do? How did she know how to actually create such a network?
That was the first thing she volunteered to do. She took her oath of allegiance in a freezing friend's kitchen, and then she obviously hid her uniform, put on her civilian clothes, and she went out and set up a network. Quite a few of the women she recruited had been in the women's military auxiliary before the war. So she had a bit of a network already. And within a month, she had 50 women. By the end of 2 months, she had 200 women operating across Silesia. So that's an area the size of Wales in the UK. Significant territory and militarily important territory as well. And so she would recruit women who worked as translators or secretaries or even just office cleaners in the German occupying authorities' offices. And this is where women become so important. Why she chose to deliberately employ women is because women tend to be overlooked and underestimated, and particularly in the 1940s by the very misogynistic Nazi German Third Reich. And so these women could overhear conversations, they could look at what the documents were lying around on desks, bring that information out, just memorise it. She employed women whose offices or just their places where they lived overlooked the main thoroughfares or the railway line, so they could see the movement of military freight and make very detailed notes on it. Or troop movements, of course, as people are being deployed, which would give the Allies an idea of what Germany's next military targets were. She even employed women who just worked in laundries and bakeries who could note the changing garrison bread orders or the different uniforms that are coming through to be washed and repaired. Because if you take those details out across a whole region every week and you number crunch it, you get a pretty accurate picture of military plans.
That is really fascinating. To be so underestimated means that you then have the ability to really operate.
That's right. Gender is actually very specifically important. A lot of the women who worked as special agents, including Americans like Virginia Hall, they were specifically recruited because they were women, because they were much less suspect, especially after the Germans started recruiting any able-bodied men of conscription age in occupied territory and forcing them to work for the German war effort. Any able-bodied man was immediately suspect. But women are keeping businesses going, looking after family, hitchhiking, cycling across terrain. And they're everywhere. And they just couldn't stop everyone. I mean, they were the river in which communication swam. So the early operation of the resistance couldn't have happened without women serving as messengers, moving around the country, couriers transporting weapons, arms, supplies across the country. And at first, the Germans didn't really consider the women could do it. But when they worked it out, they were invariably brutal in their response.
And I'm curious to know, of course, the Germans would be very resentful of the fact that there was a network of Polish women who were spying, who were part of the resistance. But what did her Polish counterparts and her superiors, who were all men, what did they think about the all-female spy network?
They weren't all men. I mean, the head of the overseas courier group, that was a woman as well, a very close friend of Zoe's called Amelia Malesso. I think inside Poland, a lot of the men very much respected the women because, especially early on, Poland never capitulated, unlike several nations. So a large amount of the men had been taken prisoner of war or killed. And so the main workforce was female. And so inside Poland, in occupied territory, their skills, their experience was really valued. But in 1943, Zoe became the only woman to get across occupied Europe, incredibly daring. There's so much drama. It was such a fun chapter to write. And eventually reaches Britain. And the Poles who'd set up their government in exile and their military headquarters in Britain, and the Brits just cannot believe that a woman has achieved all this. And they call her a captain in a skirt. And they end up calling her a militant female dictator.
You talk about how she received parachute training, and she was the only woman to serve in what's called the Silent Unseen, their special operations paratroopers. How did that come about for her?
This is something she had to fight for, as usual. At the end, she's been in London in 1943. She's completed 2 missions in London, handed over an extraordinarily important amount of microfilm. And then the Brits and the Poles in London say, we'd like to thank you for your service. No woman has achieved this much. Would you like a small flat in London to wait out the rest of the war? She says, what are you talking about? I've got to get back and serve my country. My nation needs me. So they said, well, you can't, I'm afraid, because the only way to get back would be to parachute. And, I'm afraid you're a lady. And so she's just like, okay, sign me up. I have to do it. And this is one of the things I love about her is that sometimes people say, she was really fearless. That's not right. She's courageous, not fearless. She is afraid. She's very vulnerable. One of the things she hates is heights. She has a terrible time with heights throughout the war. She has to throw herself from a building at one point. Another time she has to leap from a moving steam train. She's terrified of heights, but she does it when she has to. And here she thinks, I have to just steel myself. I may be frightened of heights, but I'm more frightened that I won't be there to serve my country in its hour of need. And so she undertakes parachute training, which involves leaping from the ceilings of buildings, then leaping from a tower. And then she does training jumps from a 4-engine British Halifax bomber. And occasionally there were horrific accidents and people didn't make it and there were broken legs. And she twisted her ankles and had to have them bound up with cloth. But she insisted on going back until she'd done the right number of training jumps. And then she was sent out. She was sent out in September 1943, the only woman to be parachuted from Britain into Nazi German-occupied Poland.
So now she lands. She's landed in Nazi-occupied Poland.
That's right.
What did she do? What were her most important contributions after that?
Well, the reason she wanted to get back so much was she wanted to take part in the Warsaw Uprising. So Poland had one of the largest resistance forces in the Second World War in their country. When Zoe has started at the start of the war, the Soviets had actually also invaded Poland 17 days after the Germans had, and the two nations actually carved up Poland between them. It was only in 1941 that the Soviet Union changed sides and joined the Allies in the war. So the Poles knew they had this very aggressive ally, the Soviets who were coming down, and they wanted to liberate their own country so they could welcome the Soviet Red Army as equals and allies rather than be beholden on them for their own liberation. So they rose up against the German occupiers in Warsaw, their capital city. And the German occupation of Warsaw had been like the occupation of Paris times 10. It was incredibly brutal. The Poles were desperate militarily to chuck these very brutal German occupiers out.
And it was one of the greatest military resistance efforts from World War II.
It was. So militarily, it was the largest organised act of defiance in Nazi German occupied territory of the Second World War. But politically, it was also against the Soviets. So the Poles were fighting for freedom on two fronts. And Zoe was at the heart of it.
What was she doing?
So her role was to organise supplies for the fighting front line. So initially she was very angry because she thought she was in the second line of defence, not on the front line. She wanted to fight with a gun in hand, but she was organising those very vital supplies to keep things going. So medical supplies across the city for the field hospitals, which were in basements and cellars, food, of course, other supplies as well. But almost immediately, the whole of Warsaw, I mean, the Luftwaffe came in and bombed it all, and there wasn't a secondary line. Everywhere was the front line. So she was serving right in the line of fire throughout the Warsaw Uprising. And the Poles felt that it would only take 2 days to boot the Germans out. But because Zoe and others like her had organised stocks of supplies, they were prepared to last for 2 weeks. But in fact, they had to fight on for 2 months because when the Red Army got close, they just encamped on the outskirts of Warsaw and they refused to let the American and British and South African and Polish pilots land and refuel at the sites they held.
Right.
So they were really really making it much harder for the Poles to bring their own liberation.
Right.
Ultimately, it was a great betrayal.
For Stalin and for the Soviets to then take control of the area and...
Exactly right.
And but it lasted for 63 days.
63 days they fought on. And this is one of Zoe's great achievements, is that when she got to London, one of her missions was to secure the legal military status of women.
And what do you mean by that?
Because the women who were serving in the Home Army, which is the Polish Resistance Army, were civilians. They didn't have any military status. The men in the Home Army were considered soldiers. So that meant that the women weren't allowed to go to military briefings. They didn't have rank, so they couldn't discipline men. It led to loads of inefficiencies and security breaches. So she had been sent out by the male commander-in-chief of the Home Army to secure women to have legal military status. Nobody in Britain believed it, and the commander who had sent her on that mission had been arrested by the Germans while she was travelling across occupied territory. Nevertheless, she drafted a decree. And towards the end of the uprising, the new commander of the Home Army agreed, and he signed this into law, which also meant that women for the first time had legal protections under the Geneva Convention. The decree came through, and that meant that until that point, when the Germans captured women, they simply shot them or they sent them away for brutal interrogation and then to be laboured to death in the concentration camps. But after she had signed that, for the only time in the Second World War, Germany set up prisoner of war camps for women. They were arrested and they were treated the same as men. They had the same legal rights. And this saved thousands of lives.
That's extraordinary. She must really be a household name in Poland, even though most Americans, I would say, don't know who she is.
Well, there's a reason why we don't know her name, and even why she's not that well known in Poland. My book's coming out in translation next year. But that reason is at the end of the war, partly it's just because she's a woman. And even the stories of the women here are still just being uncovered now and told with a sort of respect and dignity they should have.
Which is a tragedy, let's be honest.
Which is one terrible thing. But we are beginning to address that, I believe. But of course, in Poland, at the end of the war, while we in the West were celebrating with street parties and, welcoming the men home, in Poland, they were left with a Soviet-backed communist regime imposed on them, a puppet government and a brutal one. And the first thing they did was they invited all of the Polish Home Army resistance leaders to a meeting. They sent them to Moscow for a show trial, and none of them survived. Then they rounded up the next lot. In Poland, the Soviets recognised that women had served, and instead of giving them medals and recognising them as heroes, in 1951 they arrested Zoe. This is the great irony of her story, is that she was so close to arrest and capture throughout the Second World War. Among the very first woman to serve in the war, served all the way through to the last hours of the war.
Escaped the Nazis.
Escaped.
And yet.
So frequently. And yet after the war, she's arrested by her own government, the communist puppet government imposed on Poland. And they sent her to prison. And they tortured her. And they sent her down for 10 years. And even when she was released, they made sure her story was hidden. So this is history that's been very deliberately kept out of the history books. The Soviet narrative of the Second World War is very different to a narrative that we would recognise.
Yeah, wow. It's so sad that after contributing so much to her own country that she was then put in that situation. And I understand that you interviewed her cellmate. What did her cellmate have to say?
It's one of the most extraordinary interviews. This was a woman who was just a teenager and had been rounded up for defiance against the Soviet regime. And Zoe would have been in her 30s then. But she said that nothing could break Zoe. She was so strong, and she actually helped keep all of the other younger women going. She taught them dignity and a sense of pride in themselves. And she also taught them literally to read and write and to do maths, because this is a generation who had lost through the wartime. They'd lost all of their education. So she actually, there'd been a high suicide rate in the prisons as well of these young women, and she turned that around.
How did she describe Zoe behind bars, night after night, 4 years? Even though she's an inspiration for others, she's teaching people to read, what was it like sleeping next to her? What was going through her mind?
She's someone who doesn't suffer fools lightly, and she's very strong. She's a galleon in full sail, or perhaps a warship in full sail, and they're sort of caught up in her wake behind her. So they were quite terrified. At first it was teaching them, make your bed, have some self-respect, clean yourself properly, do this, do act with dignity. Elevate yourself above your surroundings. And they're all a bit like, who the hell is this person? But soon they began to see her because she had real constancy. Was
Zoe scared? Was she angry?
She wasn't scared. What she said is at this point, she'd felt like she hadn't finished her service because her nation hadn't got freedom yet. So she was still fighting. She felt this was still part of the fight. So she wasn't scared. She didn't have children. They couldn't take that away from her. She didn't have property. She hadn't got wealth and money. They couldn't really take much from her. And she had her self-respect, and no one was going to take that from her. But was she angry? Yeah, she was livid.
You spent a lot of time researching and interviewing for this book. So at the risk of sounding too simple and asking this question, where do you think her courage came from?
Well, I think there's many things. One is there's a Polish proverb that says, where the devil doesn't dare to go, there you send a woman. So there's this feeling of Polish women having real strength of character. And Poland, the 1863 Revolutionary Wars in Poland is sometimes known as the Women's War because so many women were active in it. And women in Poland were some of the first in Europe to get the vote because they had served their nation. So there is this strong sense of female duty and agency. And if you're going to be an agent, you need that sense of agency, right? So she has that. But it's also partly because she was brought up in this part of Poland that had been annexed into a previous German empire, and they dared to tell her what her name should be, what language she could speak, how she could identify herself. She wasn't going to be told that by anyone. And it was partly one of her most fundamental memories was watching her father at the end of the First World War. He was a big military man, a veteran then himself, and she saw him on the street crying, tears running down his cheeks, because he could hear the Polish national anthem being played openly on the streets of Poland for the first time. And she felt, right, this was one of her memories that really inspired her, that this was something worth fighting for, that it was what it was about.
After all of this, she did vanish from history, as you mentioned, because after World War II, the Soviets took over. Poland wasn't free, in contrast to what we saw in France and other countries.
That's right.
So why is it important to tell her story today?
When I was first researching this book, I was looking at Zoe at the early stages of the war when she's defending the city of Lvov. Very strategically important city.
Lviv in Ukraine now.
Exactly. And one of her roles was to organise a factory making petrol bombs. So they collected glass bottles from across the city of all sorts of bottles, whatever they could find, and, put in rags, put in petrol. And it would have been incredibly dangerous because in this basement, an enclosed space, the atmosphere was full of petrol fumes, and any spark, any bit of shrapnel hitting it would have set the whole thing up. And I was quite moved by the courage of these women, what they were doing there. And I went off and I turned on the radio, and there was a programme about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the city of Lviv, the same city, happening at the same time that I was writing this. And there was an interview with some women who were working in the basement of a girls' school making petrol bombs to throw against the invading forces. It's so resonant. And I think when we think about resistance in the Second World War, we still tend to think about the French resistance. And there is extraordinary history there. But we never really think about the resistance in Poland. And it was one of the largest resistance movements. And the information, the military intelligence they got to Britain and the Allies was of fundamental importance. And yet we still don't look at that. And if we want to understand our history and what's happening today, we need to look at that.
I tend to find that stories about courageous women are told by courageous women, and they often inspire women who are also courageous. But how can men benefit from stories about women? And I know that's a generalization, but I do find that even a couple years ago, I did a story on Virginia Hall, and two former senior female intelligence officers were fighting so hard to try to get her the highest military award in the United States. And former Secretary Lloyd Austin declined to give Virginia Hall this award because the premise was this was intelligence, this wasn't actually combat, this isn't quite right.
Do you know, it's so annoying that we still have to have this fight. At the end of the war, a lot of the women who had worked in the British Special Operations Executive, like Virginia Hall, like Elżbieta Zawadzka, Zoe, and many others, at the end of the war, they were given honours, and they were given civilian honours. They weren't given military honours. The men they had worked alongside in exactly the same roles were given military honours because women weren't entitled to military honours, even though they had done exactly the same training. We need to stop looking in terms of gender and start looking in terms of achievement. There are still issues. You know, I go to bookshops and I still find lots of the guys that are very good friends of mine, brilliant historians, their books are in World War II history and mine are still put in women's history. And I have to move it over. I mean, sometimes they're in both. Okay, that's good, but there's still work to be done about how this history is recognised. And the only reason we know about Zoe and a lot of the women in the Polish resistance is because after the war, Zoe secretly kept her own records, interviewed people, triangulated, worked it all out on a very academically rigorous basis. And all of her notes, still terrible handwriting on the backs of envelopes, are still in an archive in her hometown.
Wow, so she had to tell her own story, which is...
And those of her female colleagues.
Empowering.
And a lot of the men as well.
In the telling of this story, you really got to know her. What's a question that you wish you could have asked her that you weren't actually able to answer?
I mean, I am very lucky because Zoe gave a lot of interviews. One of them was with a journalist in the 1980s. This is in the communist period. And he actually hadn't been allowed to tape record her, but he had done because he felt that her testimony was so important. He'd actually recorded 28 tapes and I met him and he said, "Do you want to hear her voice?" And he just put it on so I could hear her laughing and sometimes choking up and crying. And sometimes she'd bang the table so much you could hardly hear what she was saying because there's thumping of her fist on the table. She's very passionate about the history. He wanted to write a biography of her and he chatted it through with her and she made him promise that he wouldn't. So he didn't. He agreed and he honoured his word. But he said, "But I didn't say I wouldn't give it to someone else." And he said, "When I met you," he just pushed the tapes across the table and said, "It's over to you now." So I felt this real sense of responsibility. I mean, it was a real privilege and honour to research this story, but a great adventure as well. So I took the tapes and I think I would love to discuss what she thinks of my interpretation of her life.
Oh, well, that makes sense. I know that you spend your time in World War I, World War II. Why should everyday Americans care about her life story and her life's work?
Story of heroism that speaks to the Allied war effort, to all of us, to men, to women, to the Americans, the Brits and the Poles as well. This is shared history, and I think often when we divide history up into neat little groups, this is the women's service, this is the intelligence war. Well, actually, all of those things go together. That's the way the leaders saw it in the wartime. You took a coordinated approach, and this is history that speaks to us all.
So great to have you. This was a fascinating conversation.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Sasha.